hopefully everybody can see my PowerPoint presentation. As Keir said, my thesis research is focused on historical archaeology, and I'm largely working with archaeology from the city of Ōtautahi, Christchurch in New Zealand during the latter half of the 19th century. To give you a little bit of background, if there are people that are unfamiliar with Christchurch, it was a planned European colonial settlement established in 1850 and initially settled by contingents of English settlers. The two large earthquakes that struck the city in 2010 and 2011 shook loose, if you'll forgive the pun, a great deal of the city's 19th century history and archaeology, both in terms of how it affected the city's sense of identity amongst an upheaval that destroyed much of its visible heritage, but also in terms of a huge quantity of archaeological work that was carried out after the earthquakes. My research uses the artefact assemblage from that post-earthquake work to look at the use and availability of goods in the city of Christchurch between 1850 and 1900. And the site I'm going to talk about today, which is an 1860s to 1870s fancy goods store, is just one of the many that have been excavated there in the last 10 years. The site is huge and I cannot possibly do it justice in 10 minutes, so please forgive this very brief overview. To start with, here we go, a little history. It's no exaggeration to say that Christchurch of the 1860s would have been near unrecognisable to those of us who know the city. The swampy open landscape on which scattered houses and buildings stood was a far cry from the city that we now know. European settlement was only a decade old in 1860. In 1860, Christchurch had also only been an official city for a very loose definition of city for 4 years. To European colonists, it would have been a frontier, a landscape, in society and in commerce. There were very few shops in Christchurch itself until the 1860s. The first was, I think, established in around 1851, but by 1854 had moved to Colombo Street, just north of Cathedral Square, which is sort of the central landmark of Christchurch. And it was here, which you should be able to see in this photograph and map on the screen, that a small hub of retail stores sprang up, including among them several cobblers, furriers, drapers, pharmacists, stationers, and general goods stores. By 1864, this part of Colombo Street was a hodgepodge of small businesses and offices, and unusually these included several fancy goods stores, including the brilliantly named well-known Little Shop, which I think sounds particularly Dickensian and is the really small building about 4 doors from the left of the image. But it also included today's subject, which is London and Paris House, the double-gabled building towards the right of the image. From the start, it's clear that London and Paris House was aiming for a sense of something grandiose. Its very name is a reference to the phrases that meant fashionability in mid-century colonial society from the latest London and Paris houses. The ambition in that name is clear when you think about the landscape in which it was established, which was so very distant from the relative sophistication of London and Paris at that time. Initially, the shop was a clothing store run by 2 sisters, the Mrs. Alice, but in 1862 it became a fancy goods store under the ownership of a man named Henry Leake, who advertised a large and general assortment of goods, which you might recognise from the title of my talk, for sale. The tone changed slightly in 1872 when the business passed into the hands of a man named Mr. Thomas Keir. Thomas, while still advertising fancy goods, sort of expanded the range and arguably lessened the fancy brand to include ironmongery and most significantly second-hand goods. He gave up the business in 1876 when it was taken over by a man with the incredible name of Fountain Barber. These advertisements can provide us with a general sense of the goods that the shop sold, but we don't actually get much of a sense of the goods themselves, the way they looked, their decoration, the style, how they felt, how they sounded, the quality of their manufacture, all of the things that would have influenced their sale and purchase, and still would. It's how we still shop today. Fortunately for us, this kind of material impression is where archaeology shines. I should say that it's rare to find archaeological assemblages from commercial sites like shops. A shop is, after all, a place in which goods are bought and sold, not used and discarded as they might be in a household. In the life journey of an object, a shop is just a way stop. It's sort of a gateway between being made and being used. Fortunately, when the site of London and Paris House was excavated in 2017, an absolutely positively giant assemblage of artefacts was found in and around this square brick structure at the back of where the shop would have been. The structure contained at least 920 objects, broken into 7,275 fragments, hidden beneath timber boards, dirt, and buildings for 150 years. Another 4 rubbish pits around this deposit also contained material related to London and Paris House, leaving us with around 10,000 fragments of 2,000 objects from the shop in the end. And as you can imagine, this was quite the jigsaw puzzle to figure out. These artifacts provided a rich and tangible illustration of what was hidden between the lines of those advertisements from the shop, whether it's in the shape and decoration of toilet wares and personal artifacts, or the style and material of serving dishes and the teawares, tumblers, plates and decanters that were intended for someone's table. Many of the objects that were identified in the assemblage had previously never been seen in Christchurch archaeology. So people tend to hold on to and repair the objects they value now and in the past, and they would rarely make it into the archaeological record. This gold-painted lustre vase, which would have had glass pendants hanging around it to catch the light, is, for example, the first of its kind that I've seen in the New Zealand archaeological record. These fancy goods speak to us of the connections that Christchurch had, despite its new colonial status and far distant location, to the rest of the world, and specifically to those markets for which the shop was named. They also speak of the significance of those connections to the people of the early city, people for whom the best of the London and Paris houses was important. The artifacts show us the aspirations of Christchurch settlers to gentility and a fashionable aesthetic in their material lives. Some objects are themselves an imitation of gentility, like the porcelain rendering of a lace-cuffed, graceful hand holding a single tulip stem, while others show their quality through their fragility and the skill of their manufacture and their decoration, like this free-blown milk glass vase, which was hand-painted with flowers. Or this amazing cut to clear fragment of lamp glass through which the light from an oil lamp would have danced in patterns. A friend of mine refers to this as the lava lamp of the 19th century, and I think she kind of has a point. An artifact like this conveys a very different message to the straightforward functionality of the ordinary clear glass chimney lamps that we usually find. Other artifacts are just a little bit of everything, like this elaborate Mallorca glazed handheld candlestick, or chamber stick as they're sometimes known, in the shape of a leaf. The stem formed the loop handle, and the candle would have sat nestled in the petals of the flower in the middle. It's an extremely elaborate version of an object that was also very plain and functional, usually when we find them. However, the archaeology also tells the story of the reality behind the London and Paris House brand. The assemblage contained many artifacts that were common, styles and forms that were cheap and readily available throughout 19th century Christchurch. Large quantities of Asiatic pheasants, brine and foliage pattern vessels, which were all very easily accessible, were found in the same rubbish pit as the fancy goods. Because this was a shop, however, there was far more variation in the types and quantities of vessels that were found, especially goods like ladles, which are extremely rare on Christchurch's domestic sites, but were present in several different patterns within the shop assemblage. This is that same distinction again between the shop assemblage as a representation of what was available to consumers, and a domestic assemblage is a representation of what has been used, broken and thrown away. They're not all the same thing. The nature of the assemblage is commercial shone through in other ways as well. Some of the artifacts still show the pencil stock marks or prices scribbled on their surfaces back in the 1860s or 1870s. It's a bit of a mental shift as an archaeologist to think of these objects as unused, even though they're broken, because they're goods that were interrupted in their journey from manufacturer to consumer. They never quite made it out of the shop and into daily life. Unlike most archaeological discoveries, they're not an assemblage of use, they're an assemblage of availability. And this is, at least to me, in large part where their value lies. However, they were broken and subsequently discarded, and there are a lot of accounts that describe ways in which items in a shop might have been broken. My favourite involves a Labrador that got locked in a shop overnight and burst out through the front window in front of the startled policeman. I would love to say that this was how these particular artifacts got broken, but I don't think I can. However, they were broken, and however that happened, the fact that these artifacts were interrupted before they could be purchased, before they could enter the cycle of use and discard that we're used to seeing in a household, it means that they can provide us with a perspective on the types of goods people had and the way they valued them, and what was available to them that we don't often get to see. Even though they're unused, their stories didn't end in the ground. Instead, now, to me, 150, 170 years later, they tell a story that's both distant and familiar and offer a glimpse behind the commercial veil of 19th century Christchurch. And a little plug at the end, if you want to read anything more about my research or about Christchurch archaeology, I write a blog with a friend of mine called The City Remains, and you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you very much. And yeah, firstly, yes, please, there's no real way in a webinar to kind of applaud properly as you would normally, so except my slight hand clapping. And then secondly, yes, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I will unmute the first. So Cassie, you should be unmuted.
Beautiful. Firstly, thank you for tonight, Jessie. I just wondered, Cornelius Holtorf in 2018 referred to the belief that cultural heritage offers descendant communities a positive self-identity, a shared history, and a tangible link to place, which in turn provides resilience in the face of disturbance or disaster. Do you think that your research has the capacity to provide that sense of identity for Kiwis, basically, from Christchurch after the earthquakes?
Gosh, it's a loaded question. I would like to think so. We've done a lot of public archaeology. I've worked in Christchurch for a long time, and we did a lot of sort of public engagement and community outreach during that time, and certainly everyone from Christchurch that we engaged with found some of that sense of heritage in the things that we were sharing that we had found. We had people contacting us through our blog and Facebook pages and things like that to say that their grandparents had lived in a place that we had excavated, or that an artifact reminded them of their families, that sort of thing. In the broader sense, in terms of Christchurch identity itself after the earthquakes, I think it has a contribution to make. I'm not sure whether we have made it yet. I would like to think that we have started to, but it's a very complicated situation. There's a woman called Katie Pickles who writes about how the identity of Christchurch has been ruptured by the earthquakes, and how that rupturing involves not just the ground, but the sense of heritage and identity in the city. And archaeology has a place in that, and taking us back to the 19th century, which has largely been removed from the visible heritage of the city. But we're working on it, I guess, is the answer to that question. There is a space for it, and we are trying.
Yeah, I think especially with your engagement with the public, with the social media, I think that definitely has the capacity to bring in people who wouldn't otherwise be exposed to archaeology. So
yeah, that's what I hope. That's what we were going for.
Yeah, keep it up.
Thank you.
And we have another question from Ian. I don't know if Ian, you'd like to be unmuted and ask a question yourself. Otherwise, I'm entirely happy to read it out. Generally, if people can use in this case, hasn't got a microphone, so I'm happy to do that. Generally, if you raise your hand, I will unmute you. If you don't have a microphone, I'm happy to read out questions. So Ian Walkerden says, do you think that the breakages could be attributed to earthquake activity, given that it's Christchurch after all?
Yes, so that was an option, actually. There was an earthquake in 1870, and I think one in 1869 as well. Unfortunately, the dates for the deposition of the assemblage don't quite line up with the earthquakes. There were reports in the newspapers that the earthquakes resulted in a lot of damage, especially in commercial premises in the city, and I would have loved to have those two things line up. But unfortunately, it just doesn't quite fit. It's still a possibility. I can't say for sure because of the dates.
withheld the fight, unmuted myself. Thank you. And any other questions at all before we move on to our second speaker? And bearing in mind that I think Jessie may go to bed after this because she's not in Victoria and has somewhat different timelines, which I have to confess, when I was setting this up, I completely forgot that you might not be in our time zone. So apologies for that. Okay, well, thank you very much to Jessie again. For a very pathetic round of applause from me. And in which case, we'll move on to our second speaker, who is Greg Hil. Greg is an English archaeologist by way of New Zealand, so keeping up the Kiwi connection, and is also doing a PhD currently with Professor Susan Lawrence. And we're now going to have a slight sort of sleight of hand because Greg's internet connection is not the best, and so I'm going to try and show his slides for him, and we'll see how well this works. What could possibly go wrong? That's what I would say. Okay,
oh, very
Greg,
good. Yes, I can see my slides. Yeah.
Wonderful. I will mute myself, and if you just tell me when you want the next slide.
Yeah, so the way we'll do this is I'll just say, I'll sneak a little word slide or something like that, and we'll move on to the next slide as I go. So slide. And so yes, I'm Greg. I'm at the Trobe University doing my PhD. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about some stuff I did in New Zealand as well as the stuff that I'm doing my PhD on. And so the title of my talk is Tracking and Modeling Landscape Change Through Time with GIS. And so we'll go over some basics first. What do I mean when I say landscape change? I'm talking about natural cultural processes such as coastal erosion, sea level rise, mining and urban development. So large scale changes that took place to the world around us. And for those who don't know, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. And it's sort of like Google Earth, but much more powerful. And so it's mapping software that's useful for archaeologists that are working, or researchers that are working on landscape scales. So it's really good software that we can use for our research that allows us to investigate things like landscape change. And so I've got a couple case studies. So slide. So I've got a couple of case studies where I'll go over this. So why is understanding landscape change useful for archaeologists? So archaeological sites exist within a landscape, and so they're affected by changes to that landscape. And understanding those landscape changes can help archaeologists to interpret what they cover when they're excavating and they find things within that landscape again. So, and it can also help archaeologists to better manage cultural heritage, whether that means protecting it by leaving it alone and not digging it up, or carefully excavating it before it's destroyed by either natural or cultural processes. And I'll provide some examples of those natural or cultural processes now. So I've got two case study areas. The first one we'll be looking at is in New Zealand. And so we'll be looking at sea level rise and erosion. And so the map on the left shows that there's two separate areas. So those of you from New Zealand and Otago University, I know there's a couple, will be familiar with these areas. But the top circle is Blueskin Bay, which you can see on the right side of the screen. Those two circles in that right map represent Maori settlement sites from the 14th century AD. And so these represent some of the earliest human settlement on the Otago coastline. So there are two sort of settlement sites there. And so the whole Blueskin Bay has about 26 recorded archaeological sites that range from areas that are soft shore and also areas that are a little bit higher elevation that are like sort of hard coast. So slide. And so I wanted to know what the effects of sea level rise would have on this part of the New Zealand coastline. And so we all know that sea level rise is this new future that we're facing and we're currently going through, but through climate change. And so I wanted to model it to figure out how these sites would be affected. So what I have on the left side is LiDAR collected in 2004 across the whole New Zealand coastline, at least for the Otago coastline, I should say. And so on the right side is an aerial image from 2013. And so LiDAR it allows you to create a digital reconstruction of a given landscape. And because it's digital, I can bring it into my computer GIS mapping software. And next slide. And using what we know is the current high tide just from our buoys and the ways of knowing how high tides are, I was able to model it. And so this is where current high tides are today. And then the worst case scenario, which will be the next slide, is when they increase by a meter. And so I visited all these sites and got GPS information for them. So then I was able to figure out which sites would be affected and where. And so this could help archaeologists to salvage archaeological sites that are at high risk of being inundated by the effects of sea level rise. So next slide. So this is moving on to our next case today, looking at coastal erosion. This is a photo taken at Papa Nui Inlet, also in Otago. And this is a big, thick deposit of midden. So this would have been a feast of people from hundreds of years ago. And you can see by the coastline there that it's been ripped apart, and that's from erosion. And so that's another form of landscape change I'm about to talk about. So I wanted to use my mapping software to track those processes. Next slide. So what I did is I took aerial images from 1958, 1970, and 2016, and I overlaid them in my mapping software, and I use this extension on the bottom right that automatically creates transects and measures the distance between coastlines. So next slide. And that produced this. So the red are areas that have eroded, and the green are areas that have prograded. So the green areas have increased since 1958, and the red areas have eroded. And the triangles are archaeological sites. And so this type of mapping can help archaeologists to know the best place to excavate if we want to salvage these sites before they are completely eroded. And obviously you wouldn't want to excavate in an area that's increased by 145 meters, because that is going to be sterile deposits, or at least sterile deposits are, it's not going to have anything archaeological in it yet. So next slide. So I'll now bring us to Victoria, and I'll look at some inland ways that landscapes change. And so there's really good examples of this are gold mining, which moved a lot of earth, and also urbanization. So two very good examples of landscape change inland. I don't have time to talk about both, so I'm going to talk about urbanization today in Melbourne's Hoddle Grid, which is the other name for the CBD. And this picture on the right is it created quite a stir because they found a couple meters of imported fill overlaying building footings. And so basically in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of areas across the Hoddle Grid that were low-lying, and they were filling up with liquid and creating lots of public health problems. And so they passed acts of parliament to raise these areas up. And so that photo you see there is an example of an area that we weren't expecting to find 2 meters below the ground. And anyone interested in that can see a newspaper article at the bottom there, which you can Google, which will give you a bit more information. All right, next slide. So this is Melbourne in 1838, a painting. And you can see that Melbourne's Hoddle Grid, which this is their CBD area, is situated on undulating ground. And in the middle, going from sort of top to bottom, is a ex-creek called Williams Creek that ran down what is today Elizabeth Street. And on the left, you can see a slight rise, which is Batman's Hill, which was actually removed in the 1860s, or from the 1860s. And so what I wanted to figure out was how this landscape you see in front of you had changed from then to the end of the 19th century, to try and capture that 19th century landscape change. So next slide. So what I did is I took a contour map from 1853, and I traced all the contours in my mapping software, and I created this digital elevation model. So areas in white are high, and areas in that sort of lighter blue are low. And you can see that little point on the bottom left, that's Batman's Hill. So that was the hill I've described that was removed. Next slide. So fortunately, we've got some really good elevation data from 1895 in a series of plans called the MMBW plans. And so I took all that elevation data and I created this model from that. So again, same principles as the last model. And you can already see in that bottom left that there's no longer a hill there. And so so this basically is a really, just looking at comparing the two models, you can already see some large scale landscape changes. But I wanted to measure the change. So if we go next slide. So I basically created a map that represented the differences between our two models, and the areas in yellow stayed the same, areas in red and orange were lowered, and areas in green increased. Next slide. And so if we zoom into an area, within that dotted line is the approximate area where you saw that photograph, where we know we've got a couple meters of increase. And so right where that arrow is pointing, my model suggested there was 2.29 meters of increase. And so I've basically done this for the whole CBD. And so you can figure out all the areas where you might expect to find archaeological deposits or prior ground surfaces where you might find Aboriginal cultural heritage. And so what we found with this modeling is there are actually a large amount of areas that have increased in elevation where you have prior ground surfaces and archaeological material. Next slide. And so, what's great is that the historical record actually substantiates this and talks about specific till events happening in these specific areas that the model collaborates. Next slide. And so, in conclusion, landscapes are not static. They are constantly being transformed through natural and cultural processes. Tracking and modeling how landscapes change through time can help archaeologists to manage and interpret the archaeological record. And Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, is a great way to do that. Thank you. Oh, the next slide says thank you with some people I'd like to thank.
Thank you very much. I'll hang on 1 second. Okay, stop sharing. Look, thank you very much, Greg. And again, first of all, I would like to and hand over to any questions at all. But before I pass over to other questions outside of it, to completely abuse my position of power, your slide showing the coastline changes at, I think it was Papua Nui Bay, is that possibly right?
Yep, Papua Nui Inlet, yep.
That's one. I was amazed that you have so much change in such a small area, because the satellite image you use there, or the aerial photograph you have, is clearly quite, you can see individual trees, you're not zoomed out that far. But to have an area on the left where you've gained 58 meters or so of coastline, and then in the center of the image you've lost something like 20 something meters. And it's not my area of research, but I tend to think of coastal erosion as being largely, coastal change as being largely a negative thing, that you are cut back, that you lose ground. Is that quite a common thing, or is that quite unique to that area?
So there's quite a few things going on there. There's a couple factors. For one, there's this invasive plant called marram grass, which was actually brought to stabilize dunes. So the Europeans, another form of landscape change, they thought, okay, this is great, this will stabilize our dunes. And it's rampant all over the New Zealand coastline. And it's actually, you would think that an area increasing in seaward growth would be a good thing. The problem is that as it's moving seaward, it's actually deflating the back dune systems. And so if you've got a multi-layered midden site, those middens actually get deflated into one, which can be very confusing, and then reburied. And so that can cause all kinds of confusion. So that's one factor. And so I didn't show it because I didn't have time, but with Blueskin Bay, along the spit that's there, you have 160 meters of growth seaward as well. And the reason being is that the Otago Harbour is actually dredged fairly regularly, and they dump all this nutrient-rich sand right outside the harbour and right outside Blueskin Bay. And so that nutrient-rich sand then gets deposited over by Warrington Spit, which is over where one of the sites is, and it's nutrient-rich, and then the marram grass grows in it really well, so it propagates at an extremely fast rate. And the reason being, again, is that it's not doing it incrementally. The whole area is growing up. So you could have 20 meters of growth in a couple of years because it's 20 meters of small little plants that suddenly grow up, and it's actually wind that transports and builds up these dune systems. So yes, there's a lot. The New Zealand coastline is very dynamic, and 25% of pre-European sites are within a kilometer of the coastline. So it's a very, very important, I would say, with sea level rise and climate change, to be understanding how these dynamic processes are taking place.
I have further questions, but I think I will not abuse this position, and I'll just talk to you on another day. And instead, Caroline has a question. So if I unmute you, Caroline, you should be able to talk, hopefully.
Yep, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, cool. Hi, Greg. I've just got a quick question. Your work obviously has implications for honing in on areas of the Melbourne CBD that are more likely to contain intact deposits of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So my question is, what are the next steps in terms of implications of your work for reinvestigating areas of cultural heritage sensitivity, so areas that trigger the need for investigations of potential Aboriginal cultural heritage?
Yeah, so the next steps, I basically put in I have a cultural heritage permit in the Melbourne CBD area with Wenjing. Well, actually, it's with AV, I should say, just because it's a contested area. But I've basically all I'll be doing is going through ACRIS and reading all these cultural heritage management plans, and basically looking at areas where they found Aboriginal cultural heritage associated with these fill deposits, and then looking at that with a model, but then also looking at that with a historical record. And so, got the model now. I'm basically planning to use the model as a bit of a predictive model for areas that we might expect to find archaeological deposits or prior ground surfaces, and by that I mean Aboriginal cultural heritage, namely. So if we think of my model as a predictive model, then this could help to guide heritage advisors if during the planning stages of cultural heritage management permits, to sort of, get them to think, okay, well, actually this area is likely to have some fill deposits. Let's be extra careful when we're working here. And it also has the flip. It shows areas that, on the flip side, is areas that are lower. It can help us to sort of get a better understanding of what's going on across the landscape. I hope that answers your question. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. So I was just thinking that, we have these areas of defined cultural heritage sensitivity. And if you're in one, basically, you often have to do some certain investigations. So maybe your work will be having an impact on redefining those in the Melbourne CBD.
Yeah, and it also requires working with a historical archaeologist, because a lot of those areas are actually protected for historical archaeology, but not necessarily for Aboriginal cultural heritage, because they're not areas of cultural sensitivity. So by getting this information to the historical archaeologist to say, look, these are likely areas of prior ground surfaces, and that also helps Aboriginal cultural heritage get found as well, if people are looking in the right places.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, and we have another question from the Q&A from Liz Topping, who doesn't have a mic, so I'll act as a sort of avatar for her. In Scotland, and this is going back to my own past as well, in the Orkney Islands, they have a similar problem of coastal erosion of archaeology. Question is, how much information is needed on a sort of specific site or region for your GIS models to be effective? And therefore, sort of broadly, could this model be applied elsewhere to areas like Scotland or beyond that?
Yes, absolutely. They can. You can certainly use aerial imagery. And now with my sort of comparative modeling that I've been doing in the CBD, it raises a point that you could just use LiDAR. If you've got LiDAR, or even if you got that from drones, as I think Kat's going to be talking to us about, if you're able to get LiDAR data from areas twice, then not only are you looking at horizontal change, but you can look at vertical change as well. So you can start talking about how much the coast is eroded in volumetric terms, so in cubic meters rather than just distance. Because actually, if an area is deflated, it may still look like the coastline is still there, but it could have all been lowered and that archaeological material could be damaged. So there's a huge landscape comparisons through time is a huge area of very exciting research. And these areas that we're collecting LiDAR from now will be used 20, 30, 40 years into the future, and it'll be able to help answer some of these questions. And so, yeah, it's a very exciting time to be getting involved in all this. And certainly I'm happy to talk or field any questions about Orkney and specifics by Keir or anyone else. Because, yeah.
I was going to say, I can introduce you to some people who would be very, very interested to talk to you about certain aspects of that. But yeah, Again, maybe after. No. Can I just check if there are any more questions for Greg before we move on to our next speaker, who is Katherine Thomas? You can either raise your hand or Q&A, either one. No, in which case, thank you very much, Greg. And there should be some kind of like click button round of applause, but yeah, such feature doesn't exist. In which case, we'll move on to our third speaker, who is Dr. Katherine Thomas. Kath recently completed a PhD with Dr. Nicholas Stern out in Trobe, looking at the Willandra Lakes World Heritage Site, but she is now talking today, at least, about the use of UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, in archaeological fieldwork. In fact, I'll hand over to Kath.
Hello. I was initially asked to give this talk, and I said no, because I'm finding the current environment that I'm living in and working in very difficult to produce any work, let alone find space to think and develop ideas. Like many of you, I'm sitting at home with children who seem to view themselves as hotel guests with 24-hour room service, and a partner who can't find anything in the kitchen because the kids have a fluid structure to their typology of the kitchen objects and their need to apply that typology to put things away. So I'm really trying my best to communicate on this old DSL bandwidth, because no, the national broadband network has not arrived in our remote area of residential central Melbourne. And I've been sort of tasked with how to deal with these tools that have been thrust upon me. The current pandemic has highlighted that we are living in very different times. And this talk has been designed as a think piece to try and open up that discussion on those technological advances that have given many areas of our lives new vistas. And these things were forced upon us before our systems were actually ready to take them up, before we had a real flight path or a decent network, either physical or theoretical, for the future, as we are suddenly here. So what I want to talk about today is that the practice of archaeology has continually changed in tandem with environmental and technological advances. And the demands for technological advances, obviously, as I've said, and as you all can see, have been accelerated by the pandemic. Collaborative technological tools are now being increasingly relied upon to enable communication across multiple stakeholders within research and cultural heritage management. As we've seen, there's been a rapid uptake of collaborative video and voice platforms for meetings. We've now got potential expansion of the use of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. Suddenly we have bigger issues around digital archives, compliance, and accountability. And also that question that we've not been really had a chance to even think about or address in this rapidly taking up new tools, how we build that theoretical framework to ensure cultural safety and proper collaboration and partnership with key stakeholders. So focusing first on those collaborative meeting tools, back in March, NBN had to rapidly make available a 40% capacity increase to their network, to their RSPs, and the RSPs are the retail service providers. And this was predominantly because of the use of these chat tools. So what are these chat tools? These are these collaborative tools like WebEx, Zoom, Adobe Connect, and Microsoft Teams. And we've all had to get used to these tools and some of the negative impacts. And I'd like to look at these negative impacts and what they might mean for archaeology and our society in general. We have a huge risk of the disenfranchisement of non-technical, non-tech savvy, and people being left behind and not being allowed to collaborate because they no longer can meet on the same platform with which we're requiring everyone to meet. We also have a huge impact of the lack of access now to nonverbal cues and the lack of access now to all those complex body language signifiers which enable us as heritage practitioners to properly navigate and communicate intangible values with and for our various stakeholders. And the loss of these micro expressions and hand gestures and body positionings that were previously used to tell us whether our meetings or our ideas were having positive or negative reception, they've gone. And I have no idea today how my audience is responding. But there are some positives to these tools. These tools have now got the potential for remote access, quick engagement, an ability to truly focus on one person or a topic at a time due to the filtering out of all those non-verbal cues and distractions. And of course, there's that cost benefit, because there are far few costs associated when everyone is sitting at home paying for their own network access, heating, food, and office space. So these are some of the collaborative meeting tools. What we're not aware of and haven't really started discussing is the collaboration potential of the other technological tools. Now, I'm particularly interested now in UAVs, and I love the fact that we can use them for 3D modeling of historical sites. And for those of you who don't know, UAVs are unmanned aerial vehicles. And now I've added to my logbook of personal bests, my sad logbook of personal bests, of getting my chief pilot's license. And every talk I ever hear about technology, including the ones I give, is usually directed to the tech savvy from the tech savvy. And we talk about all those nerdy things that we can do, like 3D modeling, digital elevation models from the point clouds, and all of these other fantastic technological things. But we haven't started talking about collaboration and what we could do to develop a use case, specific insight into how we could apply that technology within our field properly for all the wishes of our stakeholders. UAVs can be used as partnership tools. There are live streaming options to enable remote access to site, and tools that will allow for the recording of archaeological site process works and monitoring and salvage before, during, and after. And this ultimately will allow for the insurance of a digital archive, to raise the accountability for the archaeological process, and also allow for the preservation of both the artifacts and the general outputs of that process of archaeological work. So in this think piece, I'm trying to open up that discussion. So, and I'm sorry, I'm just as new to these times as the rest of you, but I'm feeling that we need to focus not just on those detailed outputs, but the panorama. And this slide has a test pit that I located last week when I was flying a drone. And that information about the test pit is meaningless in high resolution if we've not established the insight and the case-specific reasons for using this technological tool. And I'd like to discuss how we might do it. So I think it's about building a better flight path and looking at who the main stakeholders actually are and the concepts of collaboration versus partnership. So who are these main stakeholders in cultural heritage? Is it the archaeologists, researchers, consultants, the government officials, the construction workers? No, actually, it's probably not any of those people, but it's the registered Aboriginal parties, the Aboriginal communities, and the public community at large. And it is how we, as archaeologists, start working in partnership to spread the connectivity of these tools and the technology across the board now, because we have a duty of care to ensure the cultural safety. We've handed that over in a proper ways, and we need to ensure the integrity of the archaeological practice by focusing on these tools in the primary fashion to develop a better digital archival process. So I suppose, humbly, I think we should start by asking the questions of our stakeholders, the communities at large. And those questions are things like, how can we use that technology, these UAVs, to safeguard past and current cultural safety? How can we do this for others? Can we use this technology to map and record archaeological work in real time with live streaming to ensure the accountability of the archaeological process? And the third question, should we use the technology to record relevant biocultural values, ecological values, qualitative information, and not just focus on that quantitative information? So I really strongly believe flying is forecast for the future. The extraordinary has become ordinary. UAVs are collaborative tools, and they have the ability to make the remote accessible. And I feel like we should start doing this by opening the conversation about how we use the tools to improve our archaeological practice. And this is by opening a proper dialogue and not just some lame chat box on a Zoom window, about opportunities for better engagement, better accountability, and better reporting of the digital archive. Thank you for listening to this think piece. Here are my contact details, and although I'm busy, and I'm never too busy to try and start this conversation properly, because as a techie, everyone always knows we don't always get it right, and we always need help with social cues. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And again, virtual round of applause. And anyone with questions, please raise your hand or insert questions into the Q&A. Once again, abusing my power as host. I got my drone pilot license, whatever you call the thing, last year as well. I know, go us. Can't drive a car, but I can fly a drone. We'll work on the second one another time. Do you view, and I ask this because I mainly work in South Asia and so on, and we've looked in the past at getting things like aerial photography done and LiDAR done, and the cost of getting a plane or a helicopter or similar in the area we're working in was absolutely, exorbitant. It kind of completely blew budgets out and just made it impossible without massive funding. And the advent of drone technology has made suddenly something which used to be just impossible quite easily accessible. And only like 5 years ago, we were still sort of paying to fly out a specialist drone person from Poland who had an octocopter, and now we could probably buy a similar drone for the cost that it took to get him involved. So I guess as a really basic question, do you think that drones are kind of democratizing, so to speak, sort of access to that kind of data and those kinds of perspectives? Because actually it is genuinely quite fascinating to see a site that you've worked on for years, and then suddenly someone has a drone and you see that same site from a completely different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can suddenly, at the moment we're all desperately excited because we can do photogrammetry and point cloud modeling. Pretty soon we're going to be able to use LiDAR, because right now, someone who has a LiDAR drone, they've got the Rolls Royce. We don't have that yet. That's still viewed as a luxury item, but yes, that's soon going to be democratized. The new iPads have come out with LiDAR functioning, like the new. So we've got all sorts of different areas of technological advance, which is definitely democratizing it. And so I'm able to use tools that I didn't have before. Does that answer that?
And so, and I won't hog you. Ken, you should be able to talk, I think.
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Hi.
Excellent. It's more curiosity. The legal aspect of flying drones around and everything. Look, I've worked 20 odd years in the aviation industry before I went to archaeology, and I know council in North Queensland, they used to they pay for aerial photography right back to the 70s. It was always a fascinating aspect, and I used that quite a lot when I was working up there. But it's more that now, everybody's complaining, you can get your drone license out, but really, how do you need permits? Have you got to be careful what you do, what you take photos of, and that sort of thing? I know from experience it's an absolutely fantastic tool. But I suppose it depends on how careful you've got to, I suppose, walk around that whole area.
Well, I think if you're asking about compliance and accountability with reporting flights, yes, you can get your first drone license, but to fly it commercially, you have to get a second license. And once you move into that category, you have to, there's very, very many layers to reporting to CASA, and CASA is the government. They don't mess around. You have to report your flights. I'm bound to a huge series of regulations, and if there's any infractions, then I'm personally liable. So yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was just curious.
Yeah, no, sorry to be so serious.
Like I said, we used to fly around, we'd look out the window and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry if I suddenly sounded so serious. Suddenly I started talking about CASA, and I was like, oh yeah, let's do it.
I was going to say, just to add on to that I know from an institutional perspective that myself and some colleagues in archaeology got our REPLs, which is remote pilots licenses, last year. And the process of getting an individual pilot's license is relatively straightforward. You have a kind of 1 week or condensed training course. You pass some exams and you're then licensed to fly. But as Kath said, anything which goes wrong, you are personally liable for those sort of mistakes. At any kind of organizational or institutional level, it's much more complex and requires a great deal more organization. As we've discovered at La Trobe, the university then has to have a sort of certification, and someone has to be designated chief pilot, who is then legally responsible for all of the individuals who are flying underneath them. And some universities have perhaps handled that better than others, with no comment beyond that. But yeah, it's one of the interesting things. I mainly work outside of Australia, and for me it was more about getting certification and sort of learning how to do it in Australia to kind of try and do best practice beyond that. But it's
no, that's fine. It was really
complex.
More curiosity than anything else. I mean, we had a Christmas party and my nephew brought around this amazing little drone that would basically a family photo. He pushed a couple of buttons and it sat there. But then, what happens if it drifts over next door neighbours and that sort of stuff, and things that you should and shouldn't do. I mean, obviously it's incredibly complex.
Genuinely, one of the things that I was most surprised by when I got my license was how aware I became of how often people break the law in terms of how they fly their drones.
Well, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I mean, and like I said, it's aerial photography. I mean, these sort of situations is a fantastic tool, and the things you can just see just by looking at a few photos a few years apart is amazing. But look, honestly, it's just more curiosity than anything else. That's fine.
No, completely. Yeah. I entirely get that.
No, I loved it. It's great. Thanks very much.
Any more questions for Kath? Looks like there's another. So, yep. Cassie, I think you're unmuted again.
Hi, thanks, thanks, Dr. Thomas. I'm not really sure if this is a question or a comment, but I just wondered if you could touch on, I guess, like there's issues in terms of access with, with economic advantages or disadvantages, but I think in terms of physical impairment or disability, that access to UAV technology is something that can really really benefit the archaeological discipline. I just wonder what you have to add on to that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we will be able to, give remote access to areas of the community, like of the wider community, that are currently disenfranchised due to physical ailments, being able to visit archaeological sites by flying, providing flyovers and all those sorts of things. And by visit, I mean visit in their own homes. So yes, that is definitely a positive. It's just trying to balance that with the possibility of also alienating other people who aren't able to join in with that on the same technological platform because they're not tech savvy, because you're only incorporating the people who are able to use the technology. So it's just trying to open up that, which I'm sure people are already thinking about, just open up that discussion further to everybody, you know.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions at all? And if not, then I'll give another lovely digital round of applause to.
Thank you. I will go have a beer and then join the rest of them. Thanks, guys.
I've been way early. Yes, and we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Jessie Martin. Jessie is currently doing a PhD with Dr. Andrew Herries, working in South Africa on a number of aspects of early human evolution, which I have to confess is well outside of my own personal area of knowledge. But I do know that Jessie has recently been a co-author on some very high-profile papers and was featured in National Geographic. So I think he's doing quite well at his PhD so far.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Keir. My name is Jessie, as Keir said, and I'm doing my PhD at the Trobe broadly on human evolution, but within a very large and internationally diverse team. So what I thought I'd do tonight in the 10 minutes I have is talk specifically about some of the fossils that we've discovered at the site of Drimolen in South Africa recently, and what those fossils tell us about the human story. And the reason I got into paleoanthropology in the first place is because what I'm fundamentally interested in as a question is who we are as a species and where we came from. And part of that question as well is what date or what time period did our earliest ancestors first evolve? So the time period we're going to look at today, and we're taking quite a jump back in time, is around about 2 million years ago. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of the fossils from that time period across Africa, but with a specific, I suppose, focus on South Africa where I work and where these more recent fossils come from. But before I do that, I'm going to take a very brief pass, and it is a very brief pass, around the fossils that we have of early Homo from 2 million years ago, particularly in South Africa. And the reason I'm going to do that, I think, is to try and help you all to understand how rare and how broken up and how battered this evidence we have is. So in fact, from South Africa, before the discovery of the fossils from Drimolen, there really were only 2 good cranial examples that may have dated to 2 million years ago and may have been Homo. The first of them is the one you can see here, SK847, and it's found at the site of Swartkrans, which is only a couple of kilometres from the site that we work on in South Africa. As you can see, it's not in great condition, although there are quite a few diagnostic bits that are preserved. And in the case of this fossil, that's why most researchers have been able to agree that it probably belongs to an early member of the genus Homo, although there's not really any agreement about which species of Homo it belongs to. And in any case, more recent dating probably suggests this fossil is around about 1.8 million years old. So it's a little younger than where we'd expect to find the earliest evidence of the origins of our genus Homo. The second, I suppose, best preserved fossil, which is not to say it's very well preserved, from South Africa at this time period, is the STW53 cranium, which comes from the site of Sterkfontein. Sterkfontein is a very famous site in general because it's a site where the famous fossil of Australopithecus africanus Mrs. Ples was found in the 1940s and 50s, but this particular specimen was found a little later in the 1970s. It's very broken up and very fragmentary, so there have been a number of different reconstructions. And perhaps because of that, there really is no agreement about what genus or species this fossil belongs to. Some researchers think, in fact, that it belongs to Australopithecus rather than Homo. And again, the more recent dating work on this particular fossil, much of which has been done by Andy Herries, would tend to indicate that it too is quite a little bit younger than 2 million years old, probably dated to about 1.78 million. So you can see that before about 1.8 million years in South Africa, we really don't have any evidence for the appearance of Homo at all. I'll talk a little bit about this later. There is some fossils from East Africa that date to about 1.9 million years that have been attributed to Homo, but they're not attributed to the species of Homo that we all are really comfortable saying is a direct ancestor of our species, and that's Homo erectus. So into that malaise, in 2015 and 2016, Richard Curtis, who was a student on the Drimolen Field School, the Trobe Field School in South Africa, started excavating a little bag of bones that came to be known as the DNH134 cranium. At the time he was excavating it, we thought it was probably a baboon, but once he had it out of the ground and we started putting it back together, we pretty quickly worked out that wasn't the case. And we set ourselves a task of trying to work out what species this fossil belonged to. And if you do want some more information about that, as Keir mentioned, I'm very pleased to say it's been published recently. So the article title's there, you'll be able to find it, and you can get really into depth of the dating and the morphology of the fossils if you're interested in that. Just a little bit of brief background then about the site of Drimolen, where this fossil is from. Obviously, we're in Africa, and specifically in South Africa. And the Cradle of Humankind is a little area that's just to the northeast of Johannesburg. It's about a 35, 40-minute drive out of the metropolis of Johannesburg. And if you look at the figure on the top right-hand side of this slide, that's an up-close and personal of the Cradle of Humankind. And you can see how close together all of these sites are. Most of them preserve evidence of Australopithecus, Paranthropus, or little scrappy bits of fossil that maybe belong to Homo. But none of them, prior to the discovery of the new fossils at Drimolen, had any good evidence at all for the existence of Homo erectus, and certainly not at 2 million years ago. This is the site of Drimolen, or at least the Drimolen main quarry. It's a photogrammetry model put together by one of our colleagues. And you can see the bottom left there where the DNH134 cranium was found. Now, luckily for us, it was in a part of the site that was still solid rock, so it hadn't fully started to turn back to soil. So when we excavated it and then dated it, we can have a very good confidence that the date actually refers to the fossil and it hasn't washed in from somewhere else. And this is the finished product. So after many weeks of gluing hundreds and hundreds of pieces of cranial fragment together and getting a little bit high on the glue that you use to do that, this was the end product. And this is, as I said, the DNH134 cranium. Now, what surprised us perhaps the most about this, once we knew it wasn't a different kind of hominin, was that it shares its closest affinities with a species that has never been found before in South Africa and has never been found before anywhere in the world at 2 million years. So what we found we were looking at was the wrong species in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so we had to do a lot of work to satisfy ourselves and, of course, to satisfy our colleagues that we had, in fact, found this evidence. Because as I'll talk about a little later, it has some pretty important implications for our understanding of the human family tree. The DNH134 cranium is, however, a juvenile. So when this specimen died, it wouldn't have been more than about 2 to 4 years of age. So one of the added complexities that we had to deal with when we were analysing it and seeing what species it belonged to is, as much as there's not really many fossils of Homo in the record, less fossils that belong to children. We had to go all the way to 1.2 million years and all the way to Asia to find another Homo erectus cranium that was a similar date. But what you're looking at here is the DNH134 cranium in red, overlain with the Mojo-Keto Homo erectus cranium in grey. And I really like this image because it gives you a very easy way to understand the similarities of the shapes of these two cranium. And the shapes of the crania are very important because what we know about early Homo and our direct ancestors is that one of the things that characterises them is a rearrangement of the brain shape. So brain shape and cranial shape as an extension of that is really important to ascertaining what species these fossils belong to. So one of the really interesting implications then as a result of this cranium is what does it change in terms of our understanding of who our direct ancestors evolved from? Prior to the discovery of the DNH134 cranium, there was a number of candidates. One of them is a species called Australopithecus africanus, which, as I've mentioned, comes from the nearby site of Sterkfontein. We know dates from, actually, these dates here are for Sterkfontein, but the species we know goes from about 3 million years all the way down to about 2.1 million years. So it's still older than the oldest examples of Homo erectus that we now have at 2 million. Another species that's been suggested as a possible ancestor to Homo is Australopithecus sediba. This particular fossil is only known from one site, the site of Malapa, and that site is in fact just 2 kilometres down the road from Drimolen. However, it dates to 1.98 million. So we now know, in fact, that Australopithecus sediba is on the landscape at the same time, or even maybe a little bit later than the first appearance of Homo erectus. Moving into East Africa, another candidate species is Australopithecus gahi. As you can see from this photo, there's not really much of it to go on. It's quite hard to do comparisons to this species because we have so few of them. But at 2.5 million years, it is old enough to be considered a possible ancestor to Homo erectus. As I mentioned before, the other interesting thing is at around the same time, 1.9 million years ago, in East Africa, there are a couple other species of Homo that we know are running around the landscape, one of which is Homo habilis. I should mention there are some researchers, however, that don't actually accept that this species belongs within the genus Homo and instead prefer to treat it as Australopithecus. And its relationship to us, where it sits in our family tree, is really an open question. It's much the same story for another species of Homo that also dates to the same time period from South Africa, Homo rudolfensis. This is a really fascinating species, and to be honest, we have no real idea about how it sits into the family human tree. So prior to the discovery of DNH134, this is a pretty good example of how most paleoanthropologists would have reconstructed roughly the human family tree. They knew that Homo erectus existed from 1.8 million years, and that slightly before that, at about 1.9 million years, existed Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. And then older than 2 million years, we have a suite of Australopithecus species. So basically what paleoanthropologists do is they draw a line from one species to another to reconstruct a family tree, and this is broadly what that tree would have looked like. A. africanus or something like it to Homo habilis, and then finally through to Homo erectus. However, finding the DNH134 chromium and therefore Homo erectus at 2 million years really changes how we have to think about what species may be ancestral to Homo erectus and ultimately to us. This is a revised tree based on some cladistic analysis that we're currently undertaking for another publication, but broadly what it shows is that it's very unlikely that Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis and Australopithecus sediba were ancestral to Homo erectus and therefore us, because we now know that Homo erectus existed on the landscape at the same time or earlier than all of these species. It's still quite possible, however, that Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus gahi, or some other as yet unknown Australopithecine is ancestral to Homo erectus that then directly gives rise to us. So what this new fossil tells us is that these other species of early Homo, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo-like species like Australopithecus sediba weren't our direct ancestors, but rather more like cousin species. And again, one of the fascinating things that we discuss in our paper that we now know is that at least 3 different types of human 2 million years ago were existing on the same landscape together. Australopithecus sediba, as I mentioned earlier, we know from the site of Malapa, just down the road from Drimolen, was on the landscape by 1.98 million years. And at 2 million years, which as far as paleoanthropological dating is concerned is roughly the same time, we know that Homo erectus and another species, Paranthropus robustus, were also on the landscape. So you have these 3 very different, but yet quite similar species of hominin occupying the same landscape, possibly and quite probably crossing paths and perhaps even interacting. And the fact that we now know that the position that we hold in the animal kingdom today is unique in the sense that there are no other species of human wasn't the case 2 million years ago, and in fact was quite the opposite. So one of our ongoing areas of research, and something my colleagues are looking at in some more detail, is what the implications of knowing that all these different kinds of humans are on the landscape at the same time are for things like the evolution of Homo tool use, to the evolution of language, and to the evolution of complex behaviour. And so that was a very quick and I hope understandable traverse across the landscape 2 million years ago. If there's any questions anyone would like to ask, I'm happy to try and answer them. So I might throw to Keir for that.
Again, thank you very much. And again, sorry, my virtual round of applause for the scores of people actually watching. I'll happily hand over to any questions from the Q&A, or if you want to raise their hands. This is distinctly not my area of expertise. I think the last time I remember looking in any detail at early human evolution, there was a Homo heidelbergensis. Does that still exist, or is that gone now?
Kind of. It's a little bit later. About 1.5 million years after all of this happens. But yeah, it's still something that most people think is probably a species that is a direct ancestor to us.
I'm glad to hear that it hasn't vanished completely, because for some weird reason, 20 years later, that still sticks in my head. And if this isn't a completely unfair question, and I apologize if it is, when we deal with human remains like in much later periods, there's a certain sort of, a respect and I don't know, sort of a sobriety around the way that we interact with human remains when we excavate them, and we treat them, and we examine them, and so on. Would you be able to talk briefly about kind of how that is for you as someone working on kind of, you know, early hominid ancestors, but how you have that interaction between human remains which are not entirely human in the Homo sapiens sense, but in that, you know, they are still part of that kind of family tree, and how you interact with that. If that makes sense.
It's a really good question, and it's actually, it's not a question perhaps that gets asked enough, because it's one of the more interesting parts of what I do. I mean, it's true that the things that we dig out of the ground at our site and reconstruct don't belong to our species, but as I've talked about, they probably belong to things that would have been recognisable to us as human, and are probably our direct ancestors. And in the case of the DNH134 cranium, as I mentioned, you're talking about a child of 2 to 4 years old. And the ways in which many of these fossils come to be in the deposits and come to be in the caves is quite unpleasant. You know, in this case, obviously, we're talking about an individual who died very young, but there's lots of fossils we have that have enormous, leopard teeth marks through the back of their skulls or in the back of their back. So, you know, these are often humans, and I say that term advisedly, who had pretty nasty endings. I think that it's different in the sense that, you know, these remains are as much related to every one of us alive today as one another. So they're everyone's heritage and they're everyone's ancestor. But I think, having said that, and perhaps because of that, you feel an incredible weight of responsibility when you are triaging these things out of the ground and you're then trying to put them back together. They are so rare and so fragile, and they are part of our human heritage in very deep time. But yes, you absolutely, you know, and they get put in, they get stored in universities in bank vaults and wrapped in satin and all sorts of things, and taken very good care of once they are out of the ground. And of course, if you don't excavate them at these cave sites, they disappear to dust within a few years.
Yeah. Thank you. That really does. I remember the first time I excavated a site which had one human remains, and it is quite an odd experience, and I think it's really helpful in terms of framing your work within that kind of broader context. So we have a question from Cassie, and then I'll go to Hayley afterwards.
Hi, thanks, Jessie. Let me think how to phrase this. So in terms of understanding like human behaviour, archaeology has that benefit of the long-term perspective. I just wonder what sort of meaningful knowledge you think we can generate about human behaviour from, Australopithecus sediba, Homo erectus, and robustus occupying the landscape at the same time, and whether you think that there's a way to determine where the cultural remains can be associated.
Thank you, Cassie. That's a really great question. There are a couple of ways that we can start to move from, I suppose, morphology through to behaviour. When we look at individual fossils, the first thing we do with respect to trying to get at behaviour, I suppose, is we assess what we call the functional morphology of the fossils. And essentially that tells us the kinds of things they would have been capable of doing. To give you an example of that, if we look at the hand of something like Australopithecus sediba, we can see that it's very close in terms of its form and shape to the hand of extant primates. And so in the case of that species, it's hard to sort of make an argument that it would have been using tools. Its finger bones are not adapted to fine motor movement. By comparison, when we look at finger bones from early Homo, we can see that they have clearly evolved towards being able to conduct fine motor movement and then perhaps manufacture tools. So we can do that for all of the different parts of morphology and all of the different species. A harder question, and certainly I think a question that will start to be asked now, because we do know that these different hominins are on the landscape at the same time, is how they may have interacted. And certainly that is a harder question to investigate, but we can start to look at things, and again, this is all based on morphology, but we can look at the kind of ecological niches that each of these different humans may have been starting to adapt towards occupying. And we can look at how those niches may have been similar and therefore overlapped, but also may have been different. It's entirely possible, and because of the kind of time scale we're looking at, that when we say they're on the landscape all at the same time, they still may never have met because they may have been moving in and out of areas seasonally. So they may have sort of overlapped in time and space, but not on that very fine scale. And that's a really hard thing to determine when you're looking at dates and the kind of error ranges we have. But I think that this is really the first time, certainly at this time period, that we've got good evidence to say that these three different, and I might say not just three different species, but three different genera, they're that different of human are on the landscape. So my hope is that people who certainly have more expertise in those kind of questions than I will take up those types of questions, because I think it's fascinating to consider how our ancestors may have interacted with other species of human, particularly given what we know about how our species now interacts with the rest of the animal kingdom and how that hasn't turned out very well for many other species in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, great. If it's okay if I just sort of add on a supplementary question to that, I just want to know if and how you do account for the representativeness of timescale in your study.
Yeah, another good question. So in the case of Drimolen, so the site we work on, it was dated using three different methods, and kind of uniquely for a cave site, and perhaps more importantly than just having a chronological date, is we have some evidence to think that the Drimolen cave filled up very quickly. So to put that in a paleoanthropological or deep time context, the time period or time slice that is covered by the site of Drimolen is probably measurable in a few tens of thousands of years, rather than a few hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps, that's a site like Sterkfontein took to fill up. So the first problem with getting a fossil out of Sterkfontein is that the deposit might date from 1.8 to 2 million years, but it also could have been filling up for that whole time. So just finding things in the same context doesn't necessarily mean they're even close in time. The nice thing about Drimolen is we're reasonably confident, and we have both Paranthropus robustus and Homo interspersed all through the site of Drimolen. There's no layer differentiation, so we're pretty confident they're together. Australopithecus sediba is a little later in time. It's 1.98 million, so technically that's about 20,000 years later. But given what we know about how long it takes species to essentially move through the phase from first evolution to extinction, it seems reasonably likely sediba may not have existed any time after 1.98, but certainly probably existed before that, because we have other Australopithecines in South Africa from that earlier time period. But it's a very good question, and honestly, we do our best essentially to be conservative about the interpretations we draw, rather than necessarily trying to solve an unsolvable problem with the dates.
Great,
thank you. And we have two more questions, which I apologise for saying. If you can make them quick, and then we'll move on to our final speaker. But Hayley, I think you're next, and then Ken.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
My question was sort of the similar to Cassie's, and that was like, what was the implications of finding, what is the oldest Homo erectus? But then also, is there any like further excavations planned to also sort of find any more remains that could be dated to as old as the one that you have?
Good question. So absolutely. I mean, we'd be there, in fact, right now, if not for current situation. But importantly, I guess, for people who are listening who are students, every year, apart from this one, the Trobe runs a field school to South Africa, to the site of Drimolen. And you can come and you can dig for these things yourself, as in fact did Richard Curtis, who, when he found the 134 cranium, was a student on the field school, and in fact when I put it back together I was. So there's lots of opportunities there. I would dearly love to find the face that belongs with that cranium, because it just in a way it's nice to be able to, quite a hackneyed term, look into the eyes of your earliest direct ancestor, but I think it would also tell us some important things about how perhaps early Homo erectus was a bit different to later Homo erectus. So that'd be a really nice thing to find. People all over the world, though, paleoanthropologists all over the world, have been hunting for the earliest origins of us for the better part of 100 years. we are nothing if not a narcissistic species. And there are lots of hominins around. Every paleoanthropologist wants to find the earliest, I suppose, direct ancestor for us. People have looked and are looking in East Africa, South Africa, parts of Asia now as well, where we have some very early remains. But for mine, I'll be trying to chase down the rest of that cranium. And in fact, it might sound like a long shot, but actually, when we were excavating last year, 2 years, we haven't found any more parts of the cranium for 2 years. We did find another little part of it that fit back on. Didn't change our interpretation, but just goes to show that if you dig in the ground, you never know what you're going to find, and there is always more to find. So I hope so, is the answer.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Jessie.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then quickly, Ken, and then we'll move on to
yeah, just quickly, no question. I just say that was fascinating. That's really what got me into archaeology so long ago, what was going on in Africa. I just want to say thanks because I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Ken. And look, if anyone has any more questions or would like to talk to me about it, you can find my email on the Trobe website. I'm always happy to have a chat. It's obviously what I'm passionate about. And as I said, there's lots of opportunities for students to get involved. So if you are interested in it, get in touch and I can't promise you'll find the world's oldest Homo erectus, but if you do, I'll certainly buy you a beer next Pint of Archaeology.
If you do that, I will happily buy you a beer too.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jessie. And then we will move on to our final speaker, which is Wenjing. Wenjing is doing a PhD also with Dr. Andrew Harries, Professor Andrew Harries, looking at the emergence of our earliest ancestors in South Africa. And with that appalling introduction, I will hand over to Wenjing. Wenjing?
Okay, so thanks for still stay with me for this vaccine. I remember when I was an intern in UNESCO in headquarters Paris, I had this colleague. He studied a PhD of philosophy. One day he asked me, Wenjing, why do you study archaeology? Do you just like to disturb the peace of dead people? I think, and then I answered, there are three main questions in philosophy. Where do we come from? Who are we? And where are we going? And our archaeologists solved the very first problem. Where do we come from? At my project, focus on a little bit different angle to where do we come from? When do we come from? So if I ask you when, you can just look at your cell phone, at your laptop, and tell me it's 9:30. And in the past, our ancestors used different kind of clock to know the time, either by candle, by the sundial, or by the water clock. But what if I found a tooth in an archaeological site? It doesn't have a clock or calendar, but where is it? How do we know the age of this tooth? We need a special clock. And the clock for me is a radiometric dating method, US-ESR dating. That's what I'm currently working on, the US-ESR dating in the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa. And today, I'm going to take you to the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa, where my project is to explore the human evolution around 2 million years ago. And hopefully, you can get some ideas about this dating method, US-ESR dating. So at first, I'd like to talking about a little about the tree of human evolution. So the evolution of human can be described as a big tree with many branches. And the story of human evolution is like a huge jigsaw puzzle, and we only got a very few pieces. The morphology and anatomical classification is hard and always take more effort. That's why we need the dating results to get an age. And my research question is to focus on this specific species, Parasaurolophus robust. And this will have to ask get a better understanding of human origin. And in order to know the age, we have to back to where Parasaurolophus robustus lived before the cradle of Humankind. So, as Jessie mentioned, the cradle of Humankind actually is a series. It's a region involved a series of sites, including the Drimolen, the Strickland, Swartkranz. I plan to use US-ESR dating to date 6 sites, but with focus on 2 sites, Drimolen and Crown Dry. There are some dates before, but there are still some questions remained, and some age are quite controversial. So then you may be wondering, why US-ESR? Why not radiocarbon dating? Well, that's because the US-ESR is one of the most appropriate dating methods here in the cradle of Humankind. It has wide dating range, can date up to 2 to 3 million years ago, which radiocarbon dating can only date within 50,000 years. And another thing is that we have teeth. It doesn't have to be hominin teeth. The bovine teeth can work very well for US-ESR. And here are some samples collected from by my supervisor Andy from the field, and you can look at like the teeth after so many years, it's already got quite fragile. So what's US-ESR? ESR, the full name is electronic spin resonance dating. It is a classical way of paleodosimetric analysis. And I assume when you're reading this 3 long sentence, you may be thinking, nah, I don't understand. It looks too complicated for me. I don't like physics. But do you like taking baths? So the ESR dating, you can imagine the tooth is just a bathtub, and the radiation flowing into the tooth during the billion years is the flow of water into the bathtub from type. Over the time, the constant flow of water will fill the bathtub, and we can measure the volume of water in the bathtub when we find the bathtub, the tooth. We can also measure the flow of water into the bathtub. If we then divide the volume of water in the bathtub by the flow, we can calculate how long it took to fill the bathtub. And then you can take a shower. To be simple, ESR dating is a direct radiometric dating method in archaeology, and it has quite wide dating range. So US-ESR dating is to combine the both data from ESR and U-series. It can be divided by this simple formula, total dose divided by annual dose. The measurements and the preparation before we can date is also quite complicated, and it takes many duplicate measurements to get better results. The same for the annual dose. We need to get a lot of information in the tooth itself and surroundings. When the tooth is buried, since it received the radiation from alpha, beta, gamma, and we want to know all the information in this bathtub. Here are some photos in the lab, and on the right is the U-uptake models. And here is a photo in Drimolen when we try to measuring the surrounding dose rate. And here are some of my initial results of US-ESR dating. And looking at these figures, you may be thinking it looks simple and a bit boring, but to me, the figure is quite vital because because possibly it could be the keys to the secret of the Parasaurus robustus, and thus to help us to understand where and when we come from. And at the end, I just show you a video in the last fieldwork in Drimolen. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say that I've been doing archaeological fieldwork for 25 odd years, and I've never seen a single giraffe or stone rock in the entire time. So it's quite clearly misleading. And also that video makes me genuinely miss fieldwork, which I guess is a kind of side effect of the current climate that we're all working in. Okay, I'll hand you over to questions. And again, my pathetic applause, but thank you very much. So first question is from Cassie, who should be able to talk.
Hi, thanks Wenjing. I don't really know much about electron spin resonance, but I just wonder whether the environment affects the sample, and if so, how does that?
That's a very good question. So the environment, if the environment has effects of the sample, you can tell it from, that's why at first this method is only ESR dating, and then like combine U-series data, because from U-series data, we can tell if the uranium is leached or uptake from the exchange with the environment. And that's also the Cradle of Humankind is a really good place for US-ESR dating, because it has relatively really low gamma spec effects to the tools. So yep, environment in fact it's like takes a lifetime for me actually to work on it, and that's the determination of the error range. I'm currently working on a program to because before we have too many data to calculate each spectra by spectra, and now we can decompose them to know more about the tools itself. And generally we not only have one sample, we have a series sample, and to give different age, and we use a method named additive dose method to try to eliminate the effects of the environment.
Great, and is that affected by whether the environment is homogeneous or not?
What do you mean homogeneous?
Whether it's the same or different in terms of the deposition.
Oh yeah, so for ESR, you had the point. So for the ESR dating, you must have to record the context. That's why, like arrays, you cannot just give us a sample and tell me to measure it. I must know the context of it. I need to analyze the like either it's sediments, either it's rock, either it's pressure. I also need to take the samples to the lab, and I also need to go there to measure the gamma spec in situ. That's also why some ESR dating in the past, they didn't quite give a good results, because sometimes they ignore the effect of the environment, and that's quite important.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And do we have any more questions at all, either by Q&A or my consumptive cough? It's not COVID, I promise. Being tested. If not, then we have kind of 5 to 10 minutes at least of general Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for any of our speakers today, apart from Jessie Garland, who has gone to bed, being in New Zealand, yeah, now is your chance to ask any questions. And I would, while you think of those questions, just like to say thank you very much to all of the speakers, Wenjing particularly as the last one, but also Jessie, Kath, and yeah, Greg, and other Jessie, who is now gone to bed. But if anyone has any questions at all, certainly have. Apart from people in New Zealand saying that they're still here and therefore Jessie should be here too. Any other questions at all? Like, yep, hang on. Ron, possibly?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, I think.
I was just curious. I was just curious about the these new, all of these types of technology, and with the talk about the aerial vehicles, the remote sensing stuff. Is this stuff translating? Is it finding its way into commercial archaeology, into cultural heritage management, or is it just something that you just got to be lucky to find a archaeologist who's interested in using it? Like, or is it? How do these things start to be used in the wider archaeological community?
Well, I think that's what I was trying to address, and thanks for asking that question. It's we find ourselves in these very difficult, fluid times now where these technological advances have been forced upon us, and we are rapidly being required to uptake these new tools. And I was trying to sort of direct us towards potential partnership and collaborative use of other things apart from the meeting tools, such as the UAVs, to enable accountability, better digital archiving practice, and partnership and enfranchisement across our various stakeholders. So in answer to your question, are they being taken up? Not yet really, but we also need to find a framework for taking them up, a theoretical one. So I hope that helps answer that.
So what would something like Aboriginal Victoria or a government body or some sort of, what would be the forum to get these technologies put forward, or these new methodologies put forward for use?
I think that it's just going to be on a case-by-case basis, and then we'll start opening it up as opening up the dialogue. I think that maybe that was why I opened up the think piece. Maybe Greg would like to have a comment on that. Sorry to drop you in it, but like trying to open up that.
With apologies for interrupting. My own experience with kind of being interested in the use of drones for archaeological surveying and similar, and then getting the license was between being interested in their use and actually getting the license, realizing just how much activity is completely illegal and shouldn't be happening. And I think there's quite a big disjuncture at the moment between what's very easily available, in terms of it's very easy to buy a drone and send it up and take lovely aerial photographs, and what you should be doing depending on where that site happens to be and what kind of infrastructure and people are moving about in that area, etc. And I think for archaeology, that's kind of a big challenge at the moment, is actually recognizing that it's one of those things where the technology is moving much faster than the legislation, and it's not enough to just kind of be like, well, I have a site, I have a drone, I'll send it up. People need to be aware of what the legislation is around that and what their responsibilities are in terms of using that technology, if that at all addresses your question.
Just with the using the GIS mapping in Melbourne to identify older landscapes or pre-colonisation landscapes. How much? I mean, it'd be great to think that every archaeology company looked at that sort of information before they did a dig, but so they sort of had an idea if they're going to go through 2 meters of top fill before they got to the original land surface or whatever. I just wonder, some of these innovations should be, it's almost critical that they're taken up just for best practice,
I think that's definitely one for Greg, and yeah, I would absolutely echo that. My impression from the outside is that Greg's entire PhD should be rewriting best practice for Victorian heritage management. So, Greg, over to you. No pressure.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, that's my research is half funded by Aboriginal Victoria, and actually the main part of the research that's gotten all this to start the PhD was looking at sludge and looking at gold mining thing, and it sort of ballooned a little bit more out to look at sort of post-colonial landscape change in general. And so, I guess in terms of making it all best practice, that's what it's all about. I mean, I guess the long-term sort of the end result of my research is the hope that as we're doing things like cultural heritage management, we're building up a better understanding of the landscape that improves through time. And so we're treating it like a jigsaw puzzle where we've got lots of little puzzles pieces that fit towards the larger image. And so, I mean, the legislation for Aboriginal cultural heritage is 2006 with the more recent regulations. And so it's obvious that 2006 version of cultural heritage is going to change through time. And with things like drones and LiDAR and things like that, we're still in a teething stage in terms of having the legislation match these new technologies and these new ways of using these technologies. And the same way that satellite imagery used to be very difficult to get your hands on, and GPS used to be quite difficult to use. Nowadays, it's those things. You've got Google Earth, you have access to Nearmap, you've got all sorts of things. And the hope is that LiDAR will start to be available like that. And then the hope is also that drones will become more of a part of our lives, day to day, for better or for worse, I should say. And so the legislation can't be static. It has to be dynamic. It has to adjust through time. And so I'm hoping that my research will help to trigger some of those changes to help us better manage. I mean, my big thing is about trying to learn the landscape. So if we're looking at these urban fill deposits in one spot, we can deal with them in another spot. And if we start finding gold mining sludge in one place and we get the thickness of it, then next time we go to a similar place just down the road, we don't have to do all this. We don't have to start from scratch. And I think the benefit of that with coastal erosion, sea level rise, urbanization, gold mining, is that by having a better understanding of the landscape, we can better manage the archaeological record. And it's about using technologies to do that. So probably went on a bit of a tangent there.
No, I think that's it. I think that's really the hope, isn't it? That we're going to just get better archaeology and better results for us, all the different stakeholders, the registered Aboriginal parties and the general community and everyone.
That's right. Thanks for your question, Ron.
Thanks.
So no pressure, Greg, but if you could just basically kind of, rewrite our general understanding, that would be great. So, and that's not a comment on Ron's question. That was just my perception every time I see you give a talk. If there are any more questions at all, otherwise I'll start to abuse my power as host and ask questions that I'm interested in instead. No, great. In which case, to Jessie and Wenjing, and this really demonstrates probably my lack of knowledge and understanding of human evolution. But as someone who primarily works in South Asia and mainly works in Sri Lanka and sort of that southern Indian tip, I've recently seen a number of articles and people claiming that Homo sapien potentially originates from Sri Lanka, not from Africa at all. Would you be able to comparatively briefly comment on that type of model and with particular reference to your own work, of course?
You want me to go first, Wenjing, and then you can talk about dates, maybe?
Yeah, go first.
So, if we're talking about Homo sapiens, it's not a new model. The model that involves Homo sapiens evolving in many different parts of the world all at one time is called the multi-regional hypothesis. So basically, what this is to say that we know Homo erectus is pretty much all over the world, certainly in Asia, Europe, and Africa, though not in Australia. We don't have any evidence for that, but certainly in Asia, Africa, and Europe, by about 1.8 million years, and perhaps as recently as the last 100,000 years. So on the basis of that, and on the basis that we have a pretty good idea that we evolved from Homo erectus, the multi-regional hypothesis essentially says that happens sort of spontaneously all over the world at the same time. So you had Homo sapiens evolving at the same time in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia. The alternative hypothesis is that modern humans evolved from a population of something like Homo heidelbergensis from Homo erectus only in Africa, and then swept out around the rest of the world. The evidence we have morphologically is scant. It's a hard question to answer with morphology. But, and I'll hand over to Wenjing at this point when I say that the oldest evidence we have for Homo sapiens is in Africa. And in fact, one of our colleagues recently published a paper to this effect, pushing back the first appearance date of Homo sapiens. So if Homo sapiens evolved in Asia or anywhere else in the world other than Africa, we would want to find evidence of them early. And so far we don't have that evidence. But I might throw to Wenjing to talk a bit about the date. Sorry to throw you in it, but that's not something I was familiar with.
Yeah, so the tricky thing about the dates is like it affected by many factors. It could be affected by the environment. It could be affected in the live machine itself. It could be affected by when you calculate it. And that's one thing, like we cannot just like find a fossil here in, like say in Asia, and we got one date and we got a conclusion. So like, okay, this date is earlier than Eurasia, and then it comes out of Asia. So I'm quite suspicious about that. So I agree with Jessie, like we need more findings of fossils, and we also need more dates and different dating methods. That's why I think Drimolen is quite a well dating method. It tests by ESR, by paleomic, and like of the days, like they give us almost all around 2 minutes. So.
And I should add, and this is to stray grossly outside of my area of expertise, but the genetic evidence that we have from modern human populations tends to indicate that African populations have the greatest genetic diversity. And on the basis of that and some other things geneticists do that I don't understand, the genetics tend to tell us that there was a single population in Africa that then spread all around the world rather than Homo sapiens evolving contemporaneously all around the world.
Thank you very much, and I will resist my urge to continue to abuse my position as host. So I'll just say that if anyone else has any questions from the audience, and I have at least one more. Hang on. Cassie, you're live.
Hi. This one's for Greg, because I didn't ask you a question. It's a little bit loaded. So considering that archaeological sites in almost all cases have undergone or are undergoing some form of destructive process or event, can we consider the processes that lead to the deterioration or destruction of cultural heritage a source of knowledge about how things inevitably undergo change and transformation? And that's sort of particularly in the context of landscape change and predictive modelling, as per your research.
Oh, thanks, Cassie. I mean, one of the titles I usually do in these talks is rethinking disturbance, and so it's the idea that for so long, I think there's been a general sort of assumption that there's a lot of processes that are just destructive to cultural heritage. And hopefully my research is starting to make the point that it's not always destructive. For coastal erosion, you can have areas that are increasing, and it's not just all negative. And so for mining, especially in the 19th century, whenever you dig a hole, you're left with material, and that material has to go somewhere. And so and back in the 19th century, people weren't using trucks to remove it, so it didn't move very far, unless, of course, it was sludge, and then it enters waterways, and then it gets inundated across other areas. So I guess that's one aspect of understanding that stuff in order to understand cultural heritage that way. But in terms of the processes themselves, what you're sort of referring to is theorist Michael Schiffer has talked extensively on this as site formation theory. And so it's understanding the cultural and natural processes that help to create an archaeological site or deposit, and then all the processes that happen up into and as part of interpreting it. So as an archaeologist, you are a process that's impacting the archaeological record, but also contributing to the way it's interpreted. So your interpretations and your ideas about where to dig and what things you sample and what things you don't sample and what things you curate and what your research interests are is a process, a cultural process that's almost as important as the deposition and to the creation of the archaeological site. And so if you look at the archaeological site as a three-dimensional structure that exists in the present, it's a fluid dynamic thing that's always being affected. And so by studying those processes, of course you can understand more. Back in the 1970s, the likes of Michael Schiffer and his behavioral archaeology cohort really thought there's this idea called the Pompeii program. So I won't get too much into the theoretical stuff, but it's about basically trying to recreate behavior from the archaeological record. And their argument was that if you can account for all the things that happened since the archaeological record's been created, then you can get closer to sort of bridging the gap between the record and the culture and the behavior that created the record. And so all of those things are very important to understand as archaeologists, and it's especially good to be mindful of the decisions that we're making as archaeologists in terms of where we're sampling, what we're looking at, and how we're managing it. And there's some ethical things there too, about what do we excavate or do we leave it alone? Do we import fill rather than digging a big hole? And there's all sorts of things. And of course, the engagement with Aboriginal and Indigenous groups as well. I've gone on another ramble, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, great. I could also rant on, but yeah, great. Thank you, Greg.
I will just say, having gone through several seasons where I attempted to give context numbers to my excavations from the previous season, it gets really complicated in terms of working out like Harris matrices when you have intersecting different annual seasons of excavation, cutting into previous excavations, and good Lord, I hate that. Anyway, moving on. Thank you, Cassie and Greg. If there are any other questions at all, otherwise I will release everyone to their Friday nights in this exciting lockdown environment. Thank you very much for all of our speakers, again, for Wenjing, for Jessie, for Kath, for Greg, for Jessie, who has gone to bed because she's in New Zealand. Genuine, sincere thanks for all of your time and contributions to this. Thank you to all of the people who've actually taking the time to tune into this. I hope that you found it enjoyable. In a normal environment, you would now have a lovely time where you can kind of mingle in a pub environment and have a drink and chat informally to people. Unfortunately, that's quite hard to do in a digital environment. So if you do have any further questions, please do feel free to email myself or any of the speakers who've given their contact details tonight. If not, have a lovely Friday night and stay healthy, stay safe, and I will hopefully see some of you at least soon again.
Thanks, Keir.
Thanks, Keir.
Thank you.